John Prescott on that spat between the Yorkshire region and the North East region of the Labour Party. Sheena.
Well, business inside the hall, but outside the buzz goes on about Tony Blair's speech. With me, the MP, one of the MPs referred to in Mr. Blair's speech, Helen Liddell, who took over John Smith's old seat in Monkland, and film producer David Putnam. First of all, Helen Liddell, we're already getting an idea that the hard left are very unhappy with some of the policy notes that Mr. Blair offered this afternoon.
I think the voters will be very happy with what Tony Blair was saying this afternoon, and quite frankly, that's what matters. If we are going to represent the people in this country who desperately need a Labour government, then we have to do it in a way that can win. I heard what I wanted to hear, both as a parent and as a politician. It was exactly the right message this afternoon, and it's a long time since I felt so buoyed up after a speech as I do just now.
Quick reaction to Mr. Scargill, who said that declaring war on Clause 4 was heresy.
Declaring war on poverty is much more important, and that's what Tony Blair did. We have to give people rights and opportunities, and that's what that speech was about. That was a winner's speech, and I think everybody in the conference, with only one or two exceptions, sees it as a winner's speech.
David Putnam, I mean, nothing trivial in asking you that as a producer. Could you have cast and had that directed better than it was?
Yeah, it's a marvellous speech, and I think what was really important, when you set out to make a movie, you try and make what we call a crossover movie, a movie that plays to more than one audience, one narrow audience. I think that's exactly what Tony achieved this afternoon. It played well in the hall. I think it will play brilliantly at home. It was totally sincere, and I think it's what the electorate wanted to hear.
Now, we're joined by Ken Livingstone, who might have been in the NEC had it not been for that new policy that you backed, quotas, which so Diane Aberton. So, I suppose congratulations on the vote and commiserations.
It's good to see the campaign group vote suddenly bucking up. It's our best result for about 7 or 8 years, actually.
Now, the speech.
Oh, there's a brilliant speech. There's a lot of very positive, radical commitments in it, and I think those could galvanise tremendous support inside the movement and amongst the British public. We are the backward, reactionary, unwashed armpit of Europe, and environmental and constitutional structures are way behind now. And there is now, it's almost like after 20 or 30 years in which we haven't caught up, there's a huge gap to come forward and close.
And what about the signals there? I mean, David Putnam said it very cleverly, signals to conference and to the country. Do you think he was playing more to the country than conference?
I think all those positive signals that people could understand were clear. They'll like them. I think it got a bit confusing for the general public when he was really talking about Clause 4 without mentioning it by name.
Yes, now,
and I hate to say this, but 7 years ago, Kinnock and Hattersley produced a new statement which is supposed to supersede Clause 4. Huge row for a year. No one outside the Labour Party paid the slightest attention, carried by a huge card vote, so it became our policy and was never referred to again as sunk without trace, and everyone's now forgotten it. I'd rather concentrate on the things we're doing for Britain, rather than a long debate about our constitution, which no one gives a damn about outside. People want to know, are we going to get a job? What will Labour do about the environment? That's what we should go for.
Well, indeed, except that he did make a point of putting that into this very important speech.
Yes, and I do have this slight sinking feeling there's going to be endless debate about it. And at the end of the day, it won't make the slightest difference one way or the other, in any more than the Kinnock-Hattersley statement. Can anyone remember the Kinnock-Hattersley statement? I argued against it for weeks on the NEC. At the end of the day, it did not matter. It made not the slightest difference.
Liddell, what from here? I mean, this is Tuesday, there's the rest of the conference to go. Is there that sense of relief now that what might have been difficult has been got over very successfully, it seems, on the whole?
There is no point where I anticipated that it would be a difficulty, but I must admit I was excited about the speech because I wanted to hear what the new leader was going to do. And obviously, as I'm the newest MP, I'm the one who has most recently been on the doorsteps. I know a lot of the concerns that people were expressing during the Monklands East by-election. And Tony Blair spoke there, and I saw a fire and a fervour that I had not previously associated with Tony. We saw it again today, and there's a feel about him. He addressed the audience, for example, of business. In my previous incarnation, I was involved with setting up small businesses. I liked what I heard because I know that community will like what it hears. It's about setting new values for Britain, about giving us pride and raising our chins again. And quite frankly, I liked what he had to say about not making promises that we can't keep. The cruelest thing, particularly to the young unemployed, is to make promises that you can't keep. It was a new set of values moving us forward, and I think today will be one of those days that we refer back to in many years to come as the beginning of our victory at the general election. That's what it's about. That's why we're all here. Everybody in this hall, I am assuming, votes Labour. It's the people outside this hall that we have to convince to vote Labour.
Finally, David Putnam, dare I suggest that you were once a paid-up member of what might have been called Lovies for Labour. Now, there's already been snide talk about Islington economics. have a suggestion that these are not Tony's people in the hall. Do you think they're cynical and wrong?
I think that's nonsense. I think what's wonderful is that Tony's found a constituency which, in fairness, Neil created, a broad church of people who actually want this country to move. And I think Ken's right to get into a reductive conversation about Clause 4 when actually what Tony was talking about was a full, flat-out constitutional change. I mean, how can you begin to change a country if you've got a party that's resisting looking at the dust in its own corners? It's daft. It was a good speech. It was the right tone for the 21st century, frankly.
Well, what he is urging is that the party must change more.
The party's got to change because the opportunity's there that allows the party to change. It would be foolish and ridiculous to go back on old arguments.
Well, you're picking up a very phrase you used there, that opportunity through change.
Well, I think that is the case. I don't think anyone minds about whether he lives in Islington, what his class background is, where he went to. Lenin was very middle class. He managed to lead all the Russian peasants in a revolution. It's a question of what you say, what you believe, and then if what you are saying chimes with what the British people see around them, this description of the squalor in this country, the need to do something about it, no one gives a damn where he lives.
Livingstone, David Putnam, Helen Liddell for the moment. Many thanks. Back to the hall.
Sheena, a lot of talk among people here about the nature of Mr. Blair's radicalism. With me, a radical member of the Shadow Cabinet, Michael Meacher. Mr. Meacher, did you take that last section on the Constitution to be the death knell for Clause 4?
No, I didn't. He said, somewhat to my surprise, that there was going to be a restatement of the aims and objectives of the party. That's as far as he went. I do remember that in the course of the speech, he made a great deal of the importance of public ownership in the case of the post office, the railways, the water industry, and I think he gave some other examples. He clearly believes in a partnership economy. The only issue is the balance between the private and the public sector. There's no question of wanting to play down a significant and major strategic role for the public sector. And I think when it's only minutes in the telling to try to assume that we know what the contents of the redraft is going to be, I think is absurd. Some people are making apocalyptic conclusions when we've hardly got the ink off the original statement.
You don't accept that the theory that goes, look, if we're talking about a direct market, dynamic market economy all the time, we can't actually do that credibly if we still have Clause 4 in place?
Well, I believe that we can have Clause 4 still in place and still have a dynamic market economy. A dynamic market economy needs a public sector. One of the things we've surely learnt from the last 15 years, that if you disengage, if you play down the public sector, the private sector also doesn't succeed. The private sector needs a flourishing and successful public sector in order itself to be as successful and effective as we would like it to be. So I don't see any contrast or contradiction between the two.
Many of your colleagues were saying, yes, it was a marvellous speech, we thoroughly enjoyed it, it impressed us. A hint, I thought, in some cases, that it was better than they'd expected. Was that the case in your case?
I think Tony Blair is the most inspirational leader that we've had. I think it was the most evocative and eloquent statement of vision that I have heard from any party leader in the last 25 years. I myself believe that the lack of vision is what is pulling down British politics. The need for an eloquent and powerful statement of vision, and the honesty, which is a very important part of it, I think is the most important missing ingredient from British politics if we are to get rid of the cynicism, the alienation and despair that grips Britain today. And I think that statement by Tony Blair went a very long way to supplying it.
Mr. Meacher, stay with us for a second. We've just been joined by Hilary Armstrong, PPS to the late John Smith. Lost your place yesterday on the NEC, so not that good a week for you, but a good afternoon for Mr. Blair.
Oh, a good afternoon for the Labour Party and a good afternoon for the country. That was a remarkable speech, a very brave speech. He could have ducked some of the difficult issues, but everything that people have challenged him on, he took it face on, faced that challenge, and let them know that he is going to take on the difficult things in life, and he's going to lead us to actually tackle those difficult things.
Did you agree with Mr. Scargill's interpretation earlier on of the last section of the speech, in which he said, look, you know, let's not kid ourselves. this means that Mr Blair's going to have an all-out attack on Clause 4, on that bit about public ownership, and that, in Denis Skinner's words, is going to create some trouble.
Well, I thought that what he did all the way through was be very honest and open with us and invite us to be the same back. I actually don't have any hang-ups about how anything's written, and I'm quite happy about rewriting things, doing it in the way that Tony was talking about, holding to our principles, but sharpening those principles for the 21st century. And so I'm not someone who's, you know, saying unless these exact words appear, then I won't sign up to things. I want to know the ideas, the way in which we will develop. And so I think that we're in for, yes, a challenging time, but goodness, there are enough challenges for us to take on, and unless we take the challenges on in our own party, we will not be demonstrating to the public that we're prepared to take the real difficult challenges on in the country at large.
Final point to you, Mr Meacher, on the constitution of the country, if I can put it that way. A big package of constitutional reform, Scotland and Wales. What evidence is there, in Mr Blair's view, that this is an attractive vote-winning package?
Well, it got a tremendous cheer today, and I would be very surprised if the attitude of the delegates is very different from the attitude of people throughout the country. He did go a lot further than Scotland and Wales. He did talk about the reform. First time I've heard a political leader say this, the reform of Parliament itself. It is outdated, and we all know, those of us who work in it, that there's a great deal to be done to bring Parliament up to date. I think Tony Blair comes in with a new brush, and I must say I'm excited by many of the things he said today.
Mr Meacher, Hilary, Armstrong, thank you very much indeed. Sheena?
Well, they're wrapping up details of party business in the hall, but outside, as you can see, delegates are not at all keen to go back to the hotels and bed and breakfast they're still talking about this afternoon. And it's ironic that after much criticism of principles and no policies, we seem to have policy noises this afternoon which have quite divided people here. Now, in particular, I'd like to talk to the two women I have with me, Cathy Wilson from the Socialist Society and Chris Herries from the Women's Committee of the NEC. Clause 4, pretty well, is in the firing line, according to that speech. Would you agree?
Yes, I do, and I think it was very brave of Tony Blair to make this statement. His whole speech about the party needing to embrace change and not be afraid of it, I think, leads us inevitably to look at Clause 4 and parts of our Constitution that really are outdated and do need to be discussed and hopefully replaced with something which reflects the modern party that we are.
Chris Herries, are you equally enthusiastic to hear what he had to say?
I was enthusiastic to hear what he had to say. I'm not enthusiastic about doing away with Clause 4 until I know what on earth we are expecting to put in its place. I'd be interested to see what conclusions are arrived at, but I don't think that automatically we ditch Clause 4 because it doesn't sound too good.
Now, of course, he didn't actually say in this speech, ditch Clause 4. In fact, he made a point of saying, no ditching, no dumping. But we understand that in the press room afterwards, he and John Prescott made it fairly clear that part of a thorough review would probably mean Clause 4 being replaced with something or other.
Well, I'm all for a thorough review. I mean, I totally agree with what Tony Blair was saying about that we're a party of change because we must change to go forward. But until I see what we intend to replace Clause 4 with, then I'm quite happy with Clause 4 as it is.
Having said that, I mean, if you're going to be part of the review process, what would you recommend?
Well, I would like to see it thoroughly looked at. I think the sentiments behind Clause 4 are very good. I think sometimes the language obscures what Clause 4 actually means.
You see, the whole point is that any motion that came before conference yesterday that was to do with public ownership was either opposed or public control was another word, and that sometimes those motions were remitted, but certainly nothing that talked about public ownership, which of course is what Clause 4 is all about, was accepted.
I think that's the problem with Clause 4. Actually, the wording is about common ownership, and yet it has become a symbol of nationalisation and public ownership in a way that isn't helpful to the modern Labour Party. And it's certainly, I don't think, relevant in today's world, and certainly won't be relevant to an incoming Labour government. So I would certainly like to see some replacement, but not of our values. I mean, there's a different argument, I think, within the party that somehow changing the words of our constitution means throwing out our values, and that's certainly something that wasn't in Tony Blair's speech and is not part of this debate.
So when Alastair, and we gather he's not a lone voice, talks about any idea of changing Clause 4 being heretical, Is he overstating the case? Is he reading too much into it, or is he simply lamenting old Labour, you might put it?
I think he does represent old Labour. And I do believe that there is a chance now for us to discuss some of the new language, and certainly about our values. I think I'd like to see a review of the Constitution, of the wording, so that we could restate our values in a way that people can understand them, because clearly the wording of Clause 4 is very difficult to understand. It's written in a language that isn't used by people today, and therefore it's not relevant to them.
New language, Chris Herries, has a somewhat Orwellian ring to it. I mean, what's the difference between new language, new policies, new principles?
I don't think that the principles are any different from what they always have been. I think that we are sticking firmly to our principles. It's the way that we explain those principles. It's the way that we adapt our policies to suit the modern world. And to put those principles into practice that we need to look at all the time. And I'm part of the Policy Commission and the Policy Forum, so I'm quite happy with the idea that the Labour Party is changing. But I think that there are things that are fundamental to it, that even when we change the language, we still keep the principles, and I don't want to throw the principles away with the language.
So, to pick another example, when Mr. Blair talked about socialism, as he put it, sort of hyphenated socialism, as opposed to the socialism of Marx, which is old Labour. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think I would. Again, it's something which we need to discuss, which we need to talk about, and I think that's what is so refreshing about the Labour Party of today, that we're able to exchange views, that we're able to exchange points of view, and give and take and listen and learn from each other, and this is why I think the policy reviews and the policy forum are so very useful.
Finally, briefly, Kathryn Smith, he said he welcomed young people's views. First Labour leader to say so for a long time. What did he mean?
I think he meant that we are a young, modern party for not just the 90s, but for the next century. And I think it was fairly apparent today, and actually all week, to see the number of young people that there are in the party now, and that are keen to join us. And I'm very pleased to see a leader of the party that is more of my generation.
Kathryn Smith, Chris Herries, many thanks. John?
Sheena, as everyone filed out of the hall after that long-standing ovation, one wag has said that all that could be heard was the sound of pennies dropping as they realised what Tony Blair had actually said, what the implications were, and what it will actually mean for the Labour Party. And I'm joined now by George Robertson, the Shadow Scottish Secretary of the Labour Party. George Robertson, did the penny drop with you immediately? Did you know in advance what Tony Blair was going to say?
Well, there was a lot of pennies dropping. I had no advance sight of that speech except the part in Scotland, which pleased me enormously. But I think what he said were a number of key and crucial things which will reverberate around the country, and I could imagine a vast number of people watching your coverage saying, yes, I agree with that, that's right. And I think they will include even Tory party members.
But the point we've heard from a number of people who've been on the programme, Labour Party delegates, MPs, union people, saying people aren't interested in constitutional reform of the Labour Party. It bores people rigid, it takes up a huge amount of time and produces very little at the end of it.
Well, why shouldn't we wait and see what Tony Blair and John Prescott are actually going to produce? What they're saying is that the people of this country have a right to see what the objectives of the Labour Party are in contemporary and clear and straightforward terms. And I don't think that for any modern party in a modern society that is unusual. This was a very blunt, forthright and very honest speech where he's pledging that politicians will get back to telling the truth. So this is part of the process. The party will have to be truthful to itself as well as being truthful to the electorate.
Do you think that part of Clause 4 about the common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange, still written in 1918, still have a place in the Labour Party of 1994?
Well, that is only Clause 4, Part 4 of the Labour Party's constitution, which was drawn up in 1918. What I think he's talking about is looking at the whole of the objectives of the party to see that they are relevant to people today. Actually, Clause 4, Part 4, which talks about common ownership, is not unusual, not unexceptional for even some of the socialist and social democratic parties on the continent. It's how it's interpreted. Well, maybe the people of this country have a right to expect some greater comprehension as to what that actually would mean in practice. He tried to set some of that out today, and I think it would have been greeted with warmth in a lot of the parts of the country.
George Robertson, putting it in a slightly historical perspective, there have been some who've invoked the memory of Hugh Gaitskell, 1959. He tried to get rid of Clause 4. and was beaten back. It's a very risky adventure, isn't it, for Tony Blair to undertake when you could be only 18 months away from an election, with the threat of, you know, we've heard Dennis Skinner, a member of the National Executive, saying, you know, we'll fight this. We're not going to roll over and see Clause 4 go away.
I think the great problem with political parties, and it's afflicting the Tories, is that they live in the past and not in the future. What Tony Blair was saying today was a vision of the future, of a modern society that has changed out of all recognition, a world community that is very, very different, even to the years that we have lived on this earth. And therefore any political party that doesn't change will be swept away with the tide. And we've got, therefore, to be modern and contemporary. And I think that
many of your members are rooted in the past. They like all of that.
They don't like that, quite frankly. Tony Blair was elected by a huge majority as a moderniser, somebody who was going to bring to politics a breath of fresh air, which is precisely what they've got. And he's saying that it can't just stop there. Don't just vote for me because, as he laughingly said, just because you think I might win. It's got to be more than that. It's got to be modernising the party, modernising the country, getting us all ready for the competition and for the challenges and for the opportunities that the new world offers to us.
During the Neil Kinnock years, you saw a dwindling of the power of the left in the Labour Party. They were seen off in all sorts of sections of the party. Isn't this going to give them something to rally round? You know, they're going to put the banner in the sand and say, we will save Clause 4.
No, I don't think that that's going to be a rallying cry that will galvanise anybody. People in the Labour Party want to win the election. They voted in huge numbers through the universal franchise in the Labour Party for Tony Blair as a moderniser. They want an updated party. Of course they won't sell the values, but he told them today, let's win because of our values and because of our principles. Don't let's disguise them or hide them. So he's asking and challenging them to come up with a contemporary vision of what the founding members of the Labour Party came up with. I think that's what people in the country would want to have. A modern world needs a modern party, and he is a modern man who can lead this country forward.
I'm sure if I asked you, was it a good speech, you'd say it was an excellent speech. What about, was it a surprising speech?
I think it was surprising, because I think he was blunter with people outside and with his own party than most people would have expected. It was more courageous than a lot of people come to expect from politicians, and he said things that I believe today most people don't think politicians would ever say, because he said some things to the parties, the Labour Party, about what it won't do, about trade union law, for instance. And I think the refreshing honesty about that, following on from a man of such transparent decency and honesty as John Smith, is something that will give inspiration to people in the country and hope for the future, that there is in politics a man who is willing to tell the blunt, honest truth to his party and get their backing for it.
There's been a lot of talk of continuity between John Smith and Tony Blair. Could you have envisaged John Smith delivering that speech with its call for a repeal of the Constitution and perhaps getting rid of some more of the shibboleths of the Labour Party?
Well, it talks about the renewal of the Constitution, the modernisation of the Constitution, and therefore I can believe and listen to John Smith, who talked and discussed this with me. He was a Scot. Tony Blair was born in Scotland. Some of the passion, perhaps, that both of them articulated came from their Scottish roots. But they live in a world, in a United Kingdom that needs to be competitive, needs to be modern. And I think, yes, John Smith would have cheered that speech on, because he would say, here is a young man who knows that things have to happen and they have to happen quickly, and the mission is a great one.
Finally, we started off by talking about how the penny dropped in a lot of delegates 10 minutes after the speech ended. Do you think once that penny dropped they were as happy as they were before?
I think they were. I think perhaps it was surprise, but perhaps as it was with Neil Kinnock when he took on Millicent, people realised that a leader is there to lead. And if they were surprised by that, they will also have been uplifted. And they've elected somebody who's not just a smiling face, not just an electable commodity, but a man of some courage and a vision, who's willing to take the party and the country forward at a time when it's desperately wanted.
George Robertson, many thanks. Sheena?
John, with me, two more representatives of New Labour, and you can see the sartorial diversity of New Labour. With me in his Denis the Menace tie, Denis MacShane, and the woolly jumper and desert boots, Jeremy Corbyn. Gentlemen, let's talk about the substance of the speech. What did you find of note?
I think it was a speech that was not a long list of policies. That's very important. And it was a speech that was about what Britain needs to do. It had a very, very core message that a new Britain has to be built. And that sense of the speech much more for the country, I think, than for party activists. So my goodness, you saw how they cheered and applauded. They loved it. I haven't seen, and I've been coming to Labour Party conferences for 25 years, a response like that to a leadership speech.
But Jeremy Corbyn, did they know what they'd heard? I mean, the suggestion there is that they only worked out what they'd heard after they left the hall.
Well, they want to win the election, and that's the desperation. I was glad there was more on international affairs in it than the statement that was put to conference on Monday. It was on everybody's seats, but there wasn't as much as I would have hoped. But I do think the serious points in the speech have to be the question of the party's constitution, and have to be also the question of full employment and the welfare state. These are key issues that if we don't get it right and make it clear now, then we're going to be hounded by the Tories for the next 2 years up to the election saying, what's your policy, what's your figure, what are you going to say? I think we should set the agenda and make them come to us.
Well, Denis said there was no policy there, and yet on full employment it was mentioned.
I said it wasn't a long list of policies, because I think that approach is exactly one that the country doesn't want, where you just have a shopping list type of politics. I think Blair is seriously re-altering the vocabulary of British politics. I think in 20, 30 years' time, this will be a historic moment type of speech.
I suggested to somebody earlier that altering the vocabulary, and someone was talking about new language, sounded dangerously Orwellian, a kind of new speak version for New Labour.
Well, there is a sort of endlessness about some of the sentences and so on that appear in Labour Party documents these days. And I can understand the desire for good presentation, and that's important, but I do think we're slightly missing the point. There are an awful lot of people on very low wages, an awful lot of people are unemployed or desperate to get a reasonable house. They need to know that Labour is going to deliver on those and is prepared to take the economic and taxation decisions that will do that. If we don't do that, we run away from it. I don't say we're going to lose the election.
Tony pledged a minimum wage. It's a very strong pledge to bring us into line with the rest of Europe.
Well, he pledged
up front.
Yeah.
If he doesn't deliver, I mean, we may not agree on all things, but I'll stand shoulder to shoulder with you on the backbenches of the Commons to ensure that in government that pledge is honoured.
I want to see that minimum wage in. I would be much happier if we started putting a figure on it, like half the male median earnings, which is what, £4.10 an hour. That is something people can work to and understand what it's about. And I will obviously, like Denis, make sure a Labour government carries that out. But there is a sort of, how shall I put it, a bit of a disturbance around the background as what is actually happening in the Commission for Social Justice, what is happening on the welfare state. The right-wing argument throughout Europe is cut public spending and cut welfare and put the onus on the individual to do it. We cannot do that. We're a collectivist party, and I want to see a much firmer commitment to the principles of the welfare state and indeed extension of it. The Swedish Social Democrats won the election on the defence of the welfare state, their recent general election after some years in opposition. I think there's a bit of a message there for us that the electorate in industrial countries in Europe do want to see the kind of security that was offered by welfare states in the past.
So you're suggesting you heard a little fudging this afternoon?
I heard gaps, if one can hear a gap.
I heard absences in the sense that I think a textual analysis of the speech would repay some considerable study. For example, no mention of the Liberal Democrats, no mention of John Meacher. It wasn't a traditional knockabout, they're the enemy, bang, bang, we're great, they're rotten. It was, as I say, a new language for an attempt, and it's a very bold attempt, an audacious attempt. It may not come off to create a new political style in the country.
It may not come off. Now, what will enable it to come off?
I think the fact that all of what Blair is saying has to pass through, if I may say so, you people. That is to say, I mean, the worst cynics in British politics all work for the media. And if there's a blockage there, then the hope, even with a reinvigorated and stronger Labour Party, you can get it through directly on the doorstep, is forlorn. That's why I'm saying he is taking immense risks, big risks, in addressing the party. It's the first speech in which everything I've heard him say in private, and I've known him many years, corresponds to what he's saying in public. That's the first time that that gap's been closed, the honesty gap in British politics, and I just hope it works, but it's a heck of a risk.
So the power is with the media, you're suggesting. Denis, MacShane, Jeremy Corbyn, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Back to you all.
Sheena, and I'm joined now by Clwyd, the Labour Party's employment spokesman, person, and Alastair Campbell, who I could say is the associate editor of Today newspaper, which he is just about, but very soon to take over in a key role as Tony Blair's press secretary. Alastair, we're talking about the media there. I mean, I suppose I can ask you both questions. One, how would you write it if you were a newspaper columnist, and how do you think the papers will cover it? And two, what's the spin you'd be putting on it if you were in your new job?
Well, one, I am a newspaper columnist, and I am going to write it was an absolutely brilliant speech.
You're surprised?
And the spin I would put on it is it was an absolutely brilliant speech, yeah. No inconsistency.
And how do you think the other papers will play it?
I think there'll be a variation of opinion. I think most papers will recognise that it was a bold, courageous speech which left nobody in any doubt what Tony Blair's about and what he thinks the direction that the Labour Party and the country should be going in. And I think some will attempt to stoke up the battle that there might be over Clause 4, but that's to be expected.
Yeah, and Clwyd, do you think there will be a battle over Clause 4?
I think there will be some battle over Clause 4, but I think the mood of the conference was they were quite excited at the thought of having a new constitution for the party. And I think it was a very invigorating speech. I heard delegates say outside, I want to go out and fight an election. And I think even people who are quite cynical about politics, the landlady where I'm staying, for instance, she thought it was wonderful. She felt really excited by the whole tone of the speech, and particularly people who feel that they can't trust politicians. I think they'll feel this is a politician they can trust. He said he's going to tell us the truth, and we believe he will tell us the truth. And I think he pressed all the right buttons, and certainly amongst the MPs there was a great mood of excitement. They thought it was a tremendous speech.
Alastair Campbell, going back to the issue of Clause 4, advanced copies of the speech were handed out with 3 pages missing at the end. All the journalists got the same thing with those 3 pages missing, and then the surprise came in those final 3 pages about the review of the Constitution. Was that because it was so sensitive that you couldn't have any flagging of it in advance? Was it because it was just that Tony Blair wanted to, you know, pull a rabbit out of the hat?
It was partly because we were late in finishing the speech, but it was also, I think there's no point denying that it was fairly clear that there was a very big story in those final pages, and that there'd be great media interest in that.
And calculation about the battle that there could be over...
No, what you want to do, if you've got a speech like the one that Tony Blair has just made, is you do want to make an impact. This is Tony Blair's first attempt to connect with the entirety of the British people since he became leader of the Labour Party, and he did that, and I think that is what that speech, the effect of that speech, it's less actually about Clause 4, it's about what Tony Blair stands for, what he thinks the Labour Party stands for, what John Prescott stands for, and what they together are going to put to the NEC, which may take the form of something that will go into a new constitution.
And what about Arthur Scargill? He said it was appalling. Is that good or bad for Tony Blair that Arthur Scargill describes it as appalling?
Well, I'm not sure, but I think it's quite good that John Edmonds, for example, clearly was not too alarmed, and that Bill Morris was not too alarmed. I think actually most people, there's been a lot of anxiety about whether this was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, but the fact is that most people will recognise that Tony Blair is right when he says that some people still don't trust the Labour Party, and that he is going to say what he means and means what he says on all the big issues, and then win the next election.
Alastair Campbell and Clwyd, many thanks indeed. Let's look at the main headlines from Blackpool today. Tony Blair has called for what he called a dynamic market economy based on partnership between government and industry. He said education would be the passion of his government. He signalled a possible end to the long-cherished Clause 4, when he said Labour needed an up-to-date statement of its objectives. That is undoubtedly the talk that is buzzing around Blackpool this evening. Tomorrow we'll be back with further coverage of the Labour Party conference on BBC One at 10:05.